Jacob's life probably seems to be the most dynamic in the Bible, but looking at the mainstream of his story described in the book of Genesis, it looks simpler than our expectations. This is the skeleton of his story within 6 episodes. It begins with him leaving for Laban's house for Isaac's advice on his marriage. Who is Laban? Isaac's brother-in-law. He is Jacob's uncle. This is followed by a very special occasion of his marriage, for which he worked for 14 years for his uncle and built his family of 11 tribes. Notice that it was not 12 tribes. In Paddan Aram, Jacob gave birth to 11 sons and 1 daughter, which means his missionary was not yet fulfilled. Then the very embarrassing accident of Dinah follows, and his return to Bethel, where he had seen a stairway, and an angel of God then received his promise, saying in Genesis chapter 28, verse 15, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now the promise was almost fulfilled, because he came back to the place along with 11 sons, and God renamed him as Israel in Genesis chapter 35, verse 10, which was the preparation of the origin of Israelites as people. Notice that the Lord had already named him Israel after wrestling with him, as stated in Genesis chapter 32, verse 28. But one more performance remained. On his way from Bethel to Bethlehem, it was fulfilled by the birth of Benjamin with the death of Rachel. Since her death, I presume that the occasion of Reuben and Bilhah, a servant of Rachel, occurred. For this, Reuben became ineligible for the spiritual inheritance in addition to the loss of Simeon and Levi due to Dinah's accident. Therefore, Judah became eligible for it. At last, it was ready to be as numerous as the stars in the sky as promised. This was the beginning of the 12 tribes who was planning to enter the promised land later in order to fulfill God's covenant. Here, let's see 12 sons and circumcision for a minute. Go to slide 26. First, the 4 sons were from Leah, and next the 2 sons were from Bilhah, and another 2 sons were also from a servant, Zilpah. Then again 2 sons from Leah. Finally, Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, gave birth to Joseph and Benjamin, but she died at Benjamin's birth near Jerusalem. Simeon and Levi revenged with misusing circumcision, hence they were cursed. Let's go back on slide 24. Before moving on to the next topic, let me give you the answer to the age of Jacob when he left for marriage. Can you guess? He was 77 when he left for Laban and married at the age of 84, and Joseph was born when he was 91. Let's go ahead in math class. Let's prove this. This is not from archaeology, but from the book of Genesis. And this helps us assume Jacob's age when he left for his marriage, as well as the Chronicle of the second part of Genesis. When you find certain numbers, such as a calendar year or an age, while reading the Bible, please pause and meditate on it for a minute and see what additional information you can get by combining it with other data. Let's begin with Genesis chapter 31, verse 25, which has the information on Joseph's birth. What happened at his birth? Yes, Jacob wanted to go back to his home. Genesis chapter 31, verse 31 explained that Jacob stayed longer in Laban's house to watch his flock. Still, we don't have any data on his age, but if you add one more passage, Genesis chapter 31, verse 41. You can figure out how long he worked to get his wives and flock, 14 and 6 years respectively. And we can discover his age when he gave a birth to Joseph. When was it? It was 14 years after he arrived at Laban's house. Let X be the age of when got there. He was X plus 14 years old. Open Genesis chapter 41, verse 46. How old was Joseph when he became a prime minister of Egypt? Yes, he was 30 years old. And was it during a famine or an abundant year? After Joseph interpreted the king's dreams, he became the prime minister. What was it? Open Genesis chapter 41, verse 29 to 30. It would start 7 years in abundance of crop and follow with a famine for 7 years. Yes, he became prime minister at the start of 7 years of abundance at his age of 30. How old was Jacob at the moment? He was X plus 14 plus 30 years old. Hold on to this number. When did Joseph meet his brothers? Look at Genesis chapter 45, verse 6. It was 2 years after the start of the famine, which means 7 years of abundance had already been over. In other words, it was 9 years after becoming the prime minister, right? How old was Jacob at the time? He was X plus 14 plus 30 plus 9 years old. Now, important question. When did Jacob come down to Egypt? Look at Genesis chapter 45, verse 9. Come down to me, don't delay. Jacob came down to Egypt in the second year of the famine. In other words, at his age of X plus 14 plus 30 plus 9. How old was he when Jacob came down to Egypt? If you know the age, you can get the value of X, right? Open your book of Genesis chapter 47, verse 9. How old was he? 130 years old. Now you get the equation of X plus 14 plus 30 plus 9 equals 130. Then X equals to 77. He left for Laban's house for his marriage at the age of 77, and after 7 years of working he married Leah and Rachel at 84. And after another 7 years he gave birth to Joseph at the age of 91. Abraham gave birth to Isaac at the age of 100, and Isaac married Rebekah at 40, and after 20 years prayer, he got Jacob at 60. Now Jacob got Joseph at the age of 91. This information brings us the chronicle of the second part of Genesis from the creation and Adam's birth. One of the most favorite stories in Sunday school is about this person. He has been pictured many times as a model of obedience and abundant grace through his position of Prime Minister of Egypt. Of course, it is also possible to interpret, but if you haven't discovered other spiritual messages from his story, it would be a shame, because there is a very important spiritual message. Let's discover it. The drama of Joseph begins with the sad story of his brothers selling him to an Ishmaelite. Please concentrate on the scenario. It is followed by a few episodes at Potiphar's house and the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, and meeting his brothers again. That is followed by Jacob entering Egypt. It ends with Jacob's blessing and cursing his children. This is the skeleton of Joseph's story. Please note the heading of each episode. Let me revise the headings in a different way with its objective. The objective is why the story comes up in the book of Genesis. Egypt, prison, prime minister, restore, Goshen, order of creation. Why did his brothers want to sell him? It was because of their jealousy, which was caused by Joseph's dreams. This was the actual story. From a spiritual point of view, the interpretation will change. The theme of the story was to go to Egypt. In other words, his brothers sold him to Ishmaelites so that he would go to Egypt. Why was he sold to Potiphar? For going to jail so that he could meet the cupbearer of the king of Egypt. Notice that success in whatever he did. What does it mean? It does not mean his success. It means that God's providence was successfully fulfilled through Joseph. Why did he interpret the king's dreams? To become the prime minister of Egypt, so that he became eligible to occupy the best land in Egypt for increasing in number. Why did he meet his brothers again in Egypt? For the restoration of the broken brothership, so that he was able to allow them to move to Egypt. Why did they enter Egypt? To settle in Goshen, so that they would increase in number under the best environment to live in. How long did Jacob stay in Goshen? 17 years. It means he lived together with Joseph for 17 years in Goshen. Do you know when Joseph was sold? At 17 years old, which means he lived for 17 years together with his father Jacob. As a result, they lived together 34 years. Why did Jacob bless and curse his children, 12 tribes? To announce to them of the order of creation. Let's go on slide 26 and see the detail. That's why Jacob's blessing was included in between Joseph's story. This was not just a blessing, but a guideline and instruction for his descendants to increase in number and live. This was an order of creation for Israelites. Actually, Jacob blessed as well as cursed his children, as shown in the table. The blessed are in blue, the cursed in red, and the others are in black. Notice that Dan was cursed to be a serpent and a viper, stated in Genesis chapter 49, verse 17. What did he do during the Judges' age? Open your book of Judges, chapter 18, verse 13. There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. They had taken this idol from Michael. Because of this, they would be removed in the list of 144,000 who were sealed in Revelation chapter 7, verse 4. Ephraim were also not in the list because of their idolatry during division age by Jeroboam, who was from the Ephraim tribe like Joshua. Another cursed person, Benjamin, became the cause of the intertribal war at the end of the Judges' age, described in the book of Judges, chapter 19 to 21. And Saul, the first king who was from the Benjamin tribe, chased David to kill him as if a serpent bites a horse. Two cursed people, Simeon and Levi, due to misuse of the circumcision, were scattered in two ways during the conquest age. Negev desert area was allotted to Simeon as their inheritance, which was not an appropriate place for them to live in. Therefore, they naturally moved to another region of tribes. In case of Levi, they were also supposed to be scattered through the curse, but they were restored during the desert age by the accident of the golden cow. They killed people who got involved in making the idol by the order of Moses. Hence the Lord chose Levi as his priest, but scattered them across all tribes. Here we can get an important spiritual message that all covenants or promises will be fulfilled without fail. You will find this through reading the Bible. Notice the sequence of the 12 sons. The first 4 sons were from the first wife, Leah, who were followed by another 4 sons from servants. Then again 4 sons were from the former wives. Can you guess how long it took to get 11 sons and 1 daughter at Laban's house, except Benjamin, who was born on the way to Bethlehem later? 7 years. This was God's providence, who can make everything possible. He built his people within such a short time by using 4 wives. With the 4 wives, physically it was possible. With the 3 wives, it was not possible. Guess how it could be in your room? It was possible. Only 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, were from Rachel, who Jacob was supposed to marry in love, and 6 sons were from Leah, who was Rachel's older sister. Dan, who was the first son from slaves, was from Bilhah, who was a slave of Rachel. And in chapter 48, verse 19, Jacob also blessed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. He blessed Ephraim as a birthright, even though he was younger than Manasseh, as Ephraim spiritually became the first son. Who were the first sons of each category? Reuben from the former wives, Dan from slaves, and Ephraim from the spiritual first son. These 3 first sons would be leaders of each of the directions from south to north, except the east, of the camp during the desert age. Let's talk about this in detail in the class of Numbers and move on here. Just remember this. Okay, let's go back to the slide 25. Summing up, the entire story of Joseph is not about how he became a prime minister, but how they settled at Goshen to increase in number. Can you imagine how many stories there are about Joseph's good deeds or excellent performances for our lesson world? It might cover more than 100 pages. Why did the Lord give us only a few stories among them in the 14 chapters of Genesis? If you carefully look at the topics of Joseph, you can find that they are only essential stories to explain about his mission given by the Lord to fulfill his covenant, right? Besides, the meaning of his name was, He increases. This was an antitype of fulfilling his covenant. This implied that his mission through his life was to guide his family to Goshen for increasing in number. This is not about Joseph's biography, but the process of fulfilling God's covenant. Back to on slide 7. After Abraham received a covenant and Isaac was called to form a basic unit home for increasing in number, then Jacob was called to establish 12 tribes to increase. And Joseph was called to prepare a place for them to increase. This was a story about God's fulfillment of his covenant and the restoration of creation order which had been broken by Adam and Noah's descendant. Next slide. This is a snapshot of leader age for 361 years from 1948 to 2309 after the creation. Is this leader's biography? Although Abraham lived 175 years, this tells us about only 40 years story of him. Isaac lived 180 years, but only 3 chapters talks about that. Jacob lived 147 years, but Genesis tells us about only his birthright, marriage, and 12 sons stories. Joseph lived 110 years, but Genesis tells us about only the stories related to Goshen. This is not their biography, but God's providence. This is about spiritual world, creation, and covenant. and Jesus' antitype and true to Jesus. What are the antitypes of him? Abraham called on the name of the Lord under tamarisk, like Jesus taught the disciples under fig tree. Jacob gave birth to 12 sons, like Jesus called the 12 disciples. Joseph was sold by Judah, like Jesus was sold by Judah. Like this, actually all stories of the Bible are related to Jesus, which come to book of Revelation and his second coming. This is the theme of the Bible. It is the revival of creation order. This is the end of Genesis. Thank you for listening.